We're going to be frosting August's beginner stencil of the month. That's our Joy, Hope, and Peace cookie. You're going to be starting with this base layer. And we want to frost our base layer 3 times. The reason for this is so that we can create a nice, sturdy, stenciled royal icing transfer that we can then detach from this clear plastic that we're frosting on and then attach it to our cookie later. I am going to be using this Frosting Artist base layer guide. You can find it over at frostingartist.com if you don't already have one. And this is what will help you frost these base layers so easily. They're just 3 frames, and each one is the perfect thickness that each layer needs to be to create your base. So you're gonna lay down your stencil and then your first base layer guide frame. Anchor down where you know that stencil is. And this design does have a lot of different pieces and textures on the edges here. So you want to just make sure that you are gently tracing along the edges of this design. You don't want to press your icing against the edge of the design. You want to trace it. This just helps so you don't push your icing underneath. Also make sure your icing is a toothpaste-like consistency. If your icing is too thick, it will push underneath. If it's too thin, it will run underneath your stencil. So you want to make sure that you get that toothpaste-like consistency. You're going to anchor down and then just scrape across. And you're just going to apply a gentle, even pressure because your scraper, you want to make sure you have a scraper that reaches both sides of your frame. That way, as you slide across, it rides on both sides, creating a perfectly flat and even layer. If you do not have this frame, that's okay. You can still frost these. You'll just make sure that you are holding your scraper at a 45-degree angle, level with the table, and you want to try and get them as thin as you see here. And as thin as you see these layers are, they're very thin. So you don't want to create a very thick layer. This will help it dry quickly so that we can layer that next layer. I'm going to turn on my desktop fan, let this dry. With the base layer guides, I find it takes about 5 minutes to dry. Without them, your results aren't as consistent, and so it could take 10 to 15 minutes for each layer to dry. This layer is completely dry. I can tell because when I look at it from an angle, it's no longer shiny and it has a nice matte finish. Also, I can touch it and I can tell that it's not tacky or soft anymore. If you're using the base layer guide, make sure that you place your first frame down and then add your stencil. And just make sure that you have the stencil hanging over the edges of your frame a little bit so that it can lift that stencil up to your dried layer. Once you have that in place, add your second frame and just sandwich that stencil in between. We're going to come through with our toothpaste-like consistency icing and add that second layer now. Again, make sure that you trace your shape. So I'm just starting at the top where that star is, and I just pulled down almost like a tint in both directions, and then I'm just going to come and follow that bottom, almost like the bottom of a square. And that's just going to tack down all those edges, and once they're tacked down, you don't have to worry too much about the icing pushing underneath anymore. And as we apply this, it's very gentle. I'm just letting basically the weight of my spatula and hand do all of the work. I'm not pressing very hard. Anchor down where the stencil is here underneath the frame. And again, if you don't have a frame, hold your scraper at a 45-degree angle and level with the table and gently scrape across. We're going to let this ride on that frame again and then get past our design there and lift up. I like to anchor my finger down on the frame here so when I pull up, my stencil and frame stay flat on the table. If you are frosting more than one of these at a time, you can pinch here in the corner and lift the whole thing up and continue frosting your next topper. We're going to let this dry one more time and then add our third and final layer to our base here. This is going to be our third and final layer for the base of our design. You want to grab 2 of your frames and place those down first to lift up our stencil to the height of our dried royal icing transfer. This will basically just hook into place. And then you'll take your 3rd frame and put that on top. This layer is a layer that is going to matter for your design. So if you want this to be a specific color, now's the time to do it. The first 2 layers, I always just frost those white because you don't see them in the final design. I am just going to be having my background be white for this design. Again, gentle pressure and scrape across. Pinch in the corner where your stencil is and peel the whole thing up. We are now all done with our base layer stencil. We can set this aside along with our base layer guide frames. You're going to grab your A1 stencil, and this is what all the rest of your stencils are going to build on. So you'll notice that this first stencil has the whole design on it. The reason I do this is so that we don't ever have any dry icing next to each other, and that just makes it so that it won't lift your stencil up and allow that icing to push underneath. You get those really nice crisp lines. Line up your joy, hope piece so that there's a little bit of a buffer all the way around the whole thing. This color that I'm using is yellow, red, and black, and I did mostly yellow and added the red and black until I kind of got it into a deeper color so it wasn't as vibrant. This kind of is supposed to represent the gold. If you do have an airbrush, you could frost this, and then once it's dry, airbrush a metallic gold over it. But for this, we're just going to do the icing. With text, you want to make sure that your icing is the toothpaste-like consistency so that you don't end up pushing underneath any of the fine details. I'm going to let the weight of my spatula and hand do all the work. I'm going to start on one end, make sure I have enough icing to get all the way across the design. One end and just pull across. And this is a fairly thick layer of icing that I'm applying onto our stencil here. I'm going to do that all the way up. By doing this, we are able to tack down all of the stencil, and you'll see how crisp of a result we'll get at the end by doing it this way. I'm going to scrape off most of this icing before we come through with our scraper. I'm not pushing hard, I'm just kind of removing most of that icing. You'll want to come in at about a 45-degree angle and just apply a nice even pressure. And since we have that nice flat base, you don't have to worry too much about angling your scraper with the table, because that flat base should help direct your scraper. So I'm just applying a gentle pressure, and you want to scrape all the way down to your stencil. You don't want to have a nice thick layer of icing because that's going to cause really messy edges. You want to be able to see your design through that icing. You want to be able to see your stencil is starting to get scraped around the design. That's when you know you have it thin enough. We only need enough icing to make our design appear on the previous layer. Anchor in one corner and peel up from the other. And you'll see, since we applied that icing nice and thick and very gently, we were able to tack down everything and we have a nice crisp result. If you are going to be frosting this design multiple times, make sure to add a drop or 2 of water into your icing bowl. And I just added some because I do have a couple more off camera that I'm going to be frosting. The reason you do this is to make sure that you have the right consistency, otherwise you will start getting messy edges. You can also see that I just put drops of the color that I need on the side of my bowl. That way I can slowly add them into my icing to get the exact color that I want. Our A2 stencil is going to be adding the white to our star. You can see that we also are going to be frosting the joy and the hope. And that's just going to make sure that our next stencil lays flat. Once you get that lined up, you want to anchor out here on the corner so we don't bend our stencil, and then we're going to do the same process we did on the previous stencil where we just gently swipe across. We just let the weight of our hand and spatula do all the work. And very gently come through and swipe that icing off. I do like to leave my white layers a little bit thicker, just so that the color below doesn't show through as much. We'll let that dry fully before going on to our A3 stencil. We're going to be adding our red on next. And this red is just red with a tiny bit of black added to get kind of a deeper red color. Again, just swipe across. Don't forget to have a toothpaste-like consistency as you're frosting these designs. And that's what's going to give you those really nice crisp edges. Final stencil will be our A4. And this one is just going to be a dark green. I got the dark green by mixing green and black together. That black just helps make that green not so vibrant and kind of gives it more of a deeper green color. There's your final design. Let this dry for at least 4 hours before peeling it off of your plastic. That way you can guarantee that this whole thing is fully dry all the way through, and then you can attach it to your cookies. Now that my topper is fully dry, I let it sit overnight, but at least let it sit for 4 hours before trying to peel it off. This just allows it to harden enough so that it won't break when we take it off this plastic. You want to flip over the plastic and just start curling the plastic away from the topper so it just falls into your hand. Let's just make sure that we don't put any pressure on this topper. And there's your final royal icing transfer. You're going to want to use an icing that's just barely runnier than what we use to frost with. You don't want to have like a flood-like consistency because that's going to be too wet. And then just go around and trace the edge of your cookie. And then I just kind of do a little squiggle of icing in the middle because this icing will push outwards when we attach this topper. And I use multiple fingers to kind of spread out the pressure and kind of wiggle it into place. Then you're going to want to come through and wipe off that excess icing around the edges to kind of clean them up. And that will just kind of give it a nice clean finish. If your icing is too runny, you'll find that it just keeps pushing out from underneath your topper. So you just want to practice until you get that right consistency where you can wipe the edges off and the icing doesn't keep coming out. If you have any spots that you can't get to, you can use something like a toothpick. Alright, now it's fully attached to our cookie there. Let this dry again at least 4 hours so that the moisture level kind of goes down. So when you package them, there's not as much moisture in that fresh icing that we just put underneath the topper.